everyone, my name is Grant, and today I'm going to be presenting the state of venture capital. Before we get into that, a little bit about me. I'm a partner at Kanto. I was previously a founding member of the American Dynamism team at Andreessen Horowitz. 3 fun facts about me. The first is I love movie quotes. The second is I'm training for the Olympics. And most importantly, I don't do caffeine. And I'm mentioning that because today I had a cold brew. So get ready. We're going to be talking about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is the state of venture capital. When we were putting this together, there's a lot of thought as to what we should actually name it, whether it's hard tech, deep tech, American dynamism. And ultimately, we decided to go back to the roots. We wanted to reference the power law. The Traders' Act in 1957 was originally made possible by this new form of finance. And as we were looking back on this, we felt like it was really fitting to reestablish the fact that venture capital at its core is backing entrepreneurs that no one else would originally back. And once that happened, a revolution was afoot. And so to start this story, software ate the world. We know this very well. This is a fascinating chart. In the past 45 years, tech has consumed the entire top 10 in the S&P 500. In the 1980s, there's only one tech company. The rest were basically oil and gas. And then by the time we got to 2025, 9 out of the top 10 companies are all tech companies. And importantly, the returns kind of speak for themselves. We're familiar with these charts. The Mag 7 has totally run away with everyone else. We're also seeing this as just a share of the S&P and the markets broadly. Almost 20% of the companies in the S&P were venture-backed. And today, that's just continued to grow. They've had a monstrous amount of traction that's led to the total market cap gain in the past few years. But most importantly, software hasn't eaten everything, right? And there's a lot of reasons why, and we're going to get into a lot of them today. But the important part of this is that before this new era of venture was taking fold, before 2022, only a few multi-stage firms really took these categories seriously. This is a non-exhaustive list, but a good representation of some of the companies, some of the firms that were taking a look at these categories pretty seriously. And then something changed. Silicon Valley decided that it's time to build everywhere. And so enter American Dynamism, again, founding member, was able to kind of see this in the front row seats, but plenty of other firms also started coming into the fold. And the exciting thing about this is as more and more firms are getting more excited about these categories, we saw these grassroots efforts where now we have full-on reindustrialized movements and everyone else is coming in. At this point, this is a small fraction of all the companies within the Cinemac universe that are investing in these categories. It's gotten to the point where the New York Times is talking about it. And so how do you do, fellow hard tech investors? But as we get into this, the most important question is, well, what even is venture capital? And let's start with what it is not. It is not clean tech. It is not science projects. It's not these moonshot vanity projects. It's a return to the basics, Silicon Valley, building real businesses that are solving hard problems. And when I joined Kanto a year ago, we were talking about the American Dynamism Cinemac universe. A lot of people ask me what that actually means. I kind of describe it as the ADCU. It's basically everything that touches huge portions of our lives and GDP that hasn't really been touched by tech yet. There's a lot of reasons why that's the case. We're going to talk about it today. But the most important thing is that these companies are changing the status quo. They're proposing profoundly radical new futures, and they're doing so in a way that brings technological breakthroughs. But in some cases, they're actually taking what already exists, fairly mature technologies, and they're bringing them to forgotten industries. So what is an ADCU company? The way I describe it is there's basically 3 pillars. The first is that it's heavily enmeshed in the physical and the digital world. It's solving real problems itself, the hardest problems internally. It's multi-product in multiple end markets. And when you take that all together, you basically have a unique technology and business model that create a vehicle that can finally deliver software and these technologies to these categories that are often forgotten about. And so that leads us to the most mature ADCU company, which is not NVIDIA, it's not Apple, it's this one, it's Amazon. And there's reasons for this. If you think about Amazon, it started out by being a physical retailer that was offering its services online. And so people were only interfacing with this online digital bookstore. but a lot of the core infrastructure was actually being built in-house. They've since extended to become everything to everyone. They threaded the needle from A to Z through the everything store. And as we look at this company, there's a lot of, I think, case studies we can take away. But I think the most important thing is today, Amazon looks radically different than when it was originally founded. It's this company that's much more of a holding company. And in turn, there's a lot of interesting takeaways that we have. But why are people so excited about investing in this stuff? Why is it so attractive? There's a few reasons. The first is that the opportunities are huge. There's differentiated moats and protection. You're investing in monopolies or oligopolies, to use the 0 to 1 framing. There's actually exit opportunities through M&A here because there's less regulatory scrutiny. And then if you make it through these early innings, you're alone. There's very little competition, the intensity is low. And then once you're through there, the opportunity for the software surface area is usually far larger than people realize. And so the opportunity and the room for second acts are great. And people are recognizing this. My old colleague, David George, and the growth team at Andreessen talked about how you can build these amazing venture scale companies in these categories that are in some cases even better than software only businesses, but it's so hard. It's really, really, really difficult to do that. It's really hard to pull off. And so all of this is great, but what does that even mean? What is deep tech? And the way I like to frame all of this is surfers have 20 plus terms to describe different kinds of waves. Similar to how a surfer knows much more than I do. I don't know much about being a wine connoisseur. I go to a sommelier. The greater you have of skill, the richer your vocabulary. And so enter this idea of the levels of deep tech. Drop the deep, it's cleaner. And we took the TRL score that NASA created when they're launching the Apollo program. And as a refresher, this is basically something that highlights whether a tech is mature or not. It starts at 0, which is the initial idea, and goes all the way down to 9, which is a full commercial application. And we tried to have a similar framing for deep tech. And so we created the deep tech score, and we're trying to use this as a framing for how difficult and challenging it is to actually build in some of these categories. So SaaS is level 0. This is your standard company. We're very familiar with what a software business looks like. It's not that deep. Level 1 would be a slingshot. This is feasible and in range. It's capital light and efficient. And it takes a lot of pieces that are fairly off the shelf. You combine them together to build something really powerful, and that's how you can beat Goliath. Level 2 is a sniper shot. This is something that's far out, but it's within sight. It's moderate CapEx and engineering requirements. It's high precision requirement, but very powerful. Level 3 is a long shot. This is something that is fully out of sight. It's feasible. There's considerable risks, but the payoff is really big. And then level 4 is the moonshot. We're very familiar with this. This is your classic deep tech company. And then level 5 is a shot in the dark. Let's see if this works. This is a fast startup. You're raising billions of dollars. There's a lot of core risks that you need to unearth. And here are some classic examples. For level 5, I think OpenAI is probably the easiest to point to. Founded before the Transformer was even created. Moonshots were familiar, Waymo, SpaceX. And then the way that we think about this on a 2x2 is if you're to break this all down, it really comes down to the tech maturity and then the capital intensity. And if you're looking in the top left quadrant, SaaS, existing technology, low capital intensity, that's what we want to stay away from, as is true with the moonshot and the shot in the dark. What we really like are these breakthrough technologies with low capital intensity or high capital intensity, but relatively mature tech. And the important thing also is to highlight that this score amounts to not just the CapEx needs, but also a bunch of other attributes, the time to revenue, the types of hypotheses that you're working with, the maturity of the technology, the market maturity, and the key risks. As I was saying, like a slingshot, you're gonna have execution, competition risk. A moonshot, classic level 4, you're gonna be dealing with science risk, potentially regulatory risk, the time to market, the market itself might be at risk. And there's a lot more that we can talk about with regard to the score, but let's actually put it into practice. What was Clean Tech's deep tech score? It was probably a 4.5, and yeah, I'm pretty sure of that. And why did we get there? So it ultimately boils down to one core thing, which is it was too early. The timing was wrong, but the reasons itself are worth highlighting. the capital needs were quite intense. There's not enough talent in the ecosystems in most cases, and so you couldn't actually staff these companies at scale. There's overly stringent regulation, and the tech itself wasn't actually mature enough. And then you have well-capitalized incumbents, you have the time to revenue, which was multiple years, but then the ultimate challenge is that you're dealing with nation-state level VC, and the competition was quite fierce. And as we know, timing is everything. All these companies on the left now work in some iteration or form today. As Mark said, every idea from the dot-com bubble would work now. The important thing is figuring out how to get the timing right. And so a lot of people are familiar with ULA and SpaceX, but perhaps a lesser discussed story is Fisker and Tesla. There's a company in the early 2000s that was trying to raise venture capital. They were trying to raise venture dollars to build an electric OEM that would service the high-end consumer market, start there, and then slowly work their way down into mass affordability. And importantly, they're going to take the best people from automotive, they're going to bring them in-house, and then use that technology and expertise to build a company that was going to dominate the EV space. That was not Tesla, that was Fisker. And Fisker ended up going under because they outsourced what they were doing on the core technology front, and that's a case study that we'll probably get into later. But the key question is actually the bottom line, which is Katerra. A lot of people may or may not be familiar with the company. They're going after construction. And the interesting question that we have today is, what does that success case look like? If you're one step earlier, genius. If you're two steps earlier, martyr. That's from Gaurav, a founder and CEO of one of our portfolio companies, Sologen. And as we've looked more at these categories, the question that always comes up is like, okay, well, why now? Why is this time different? And it really boils down to three things. The Big Bang happened in these categories. The cinematic universe was created. We started with trailblazer companies, and you needed those to get off the ground. Once you had those companies, they're able to train a sufficient amount of people in the workforce that they're able to spin out, create their own critical mass of talent in a specific locale. And then once that happened, capital markets came in and realized that there's huge potential here. So we started Trailblazers. A lot of people are familiar with the fact that they have paved the way here. So Tesla, SpaceX, Palantir, and to a recent extent, Anduril, have all shown the world and the venture ecosystem specifically that you can build really big businesses in these categories, and you can do so in a capital efficient and software-defined way. But the question that actually does matter is, well, where did they come from? The PayPal mafia, but where did the PayPal mafia come from? The Fairchild mafia. And it's important to highlight that Silicon Valley is built off these genealogies. It's how the startup ecosystem begins to thrive and survive. But the qualities of the parent company really, really matter. A lot of people are familiar with this company. There's the curse of resources. We all remember reading articles about how Google is an amazing place to live and work. I'd rather take the blessings of adversity. And the reason why is because when you're dealing with companies in these categories, you need to be able to solve really hard problems. And it turns out that that problem-solving skill extends into every other domain that you're going after. There's a reason why PayPal has had its thumbprint on all these different successful companies in the 2010s. And importantly, this one person leads to this. So you have a huge ecosystem now, the SpaceX alumni. The same is true for Palantir. And where do they live? The important thing is, as we looked back at all of this, we realized that there's actually a lot that you can take from the Detroit automotive industry. And so some of you may be familiar with this company. It's the Detroit Automobile Co. started by a founder that decided that he wanted to create an ICE vehicle and modernize it, bring it to the masses. The first company shut down. The second company you might be familiar with is called Ford Motor Company. Ford ended up leading to the proliferation of a huge economy devoted entirely to ICE vehicles, and that gave rise to the Motor City. And so why LA? Why did SpaceX go there? LA has been the center of aviation for over 100 years. It started with Glenn Martin in 1910, Alan Lockheed, and Amelia Earhart in Burbank. And its dominance is extended into all these other categories as well. We have the U-2 spy plane, space shuttle, the Mars rover. And so you have SpaceX putting shop in Hawthorne, and this leads to a year ago, and then this is today. And so we've seen an explosion number of companies that are building here. The number of venture-backed companies in LA has grown 57x. And LA is quickly becoming one of the top startup hubs in the US. And as more of these companies succeed, the talent pool is actually expanding quite rapidly. So now with just these 3 companies, you have a huge pool of people that you can go to fill your next startup, or these people are then going out and starting their own companies. And so you have all of these factors, and then you combine that with 3 really deep currents. You have cheap, ubiquitous compute, you have customer desperation and repatriation, and you have geopolitical conflict and strife. So everything is computer, and the arc of tech has gone from technology originally just being the core infrastructure of our lives to now it's touching everything. It used to be accounting software, now it's an essential daily part of our lives. And the main 2 trends that we're seeing right now are AI and American dynamism taking hold. And we've connected almost everyone in the world, and we're connecting even more with Starlink. And as we're doing that, software is touching more and more things, and it's simplifying everything. This is what a car looked like 100 plus years ago. Today, we're very familiar with what Tesla looks like. But this is true also in helicopters. This is what the old state-of-the-art looked like, and then this is one of our portfolio companies, Skyrise. And the pace of change is also accelerating. New York City 13 years ago, or 13 years apart, you're dealing with Fifth Ave on their Easter parade in New York City. And then 13 years later, you're seeing horse-drawn carriages getting replaced by cars everywhere. And there's only one horse left. With all that in mind, software does simplify everything, but it adds a bunch of complexity. You need to know how to build it. And this is the part where things start breaking. 100 years ago, when we were modernizing for World War II, we could repurpose a lot of the existing infrastructure and commercialization that we had and turn that into new technologies for fighting the war. Today, there's a lot more complexity involved in everything that we're building. And so we need to be able to reshore that and have the effective skills to do so. And so hence, we're bringing everything back, reshore and restore. This is the Foxconn factory in Wisconsin. Globalization peaked in 2008, and yet supply chains are more complex than we've ever seen. This is one of the craziest charts to me. So this is Dell and Lenovo, and these are the number of known tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. And as you can see, it's more complicated than it's ever been. And the best part about this is that these are only the known suppliers. There's plenty of tier 3s and 4s that are unknown. And it just shows you the web of connectivity that's involved in everything that's getting built. And increasingly, we're relying on other countries to put it all together. Essential components are now increasingly being created out of the US. In China, for example, our dependence has grown over 600% in the last 10 years. And these countries are rapidly outpacing us. Since 2022 alone, China's poured over $200 billion into building world factories. Our supply chains are getting more and more brittle, especially after COVID. And perhaps this is no more clearly displayed than the US military supply chains. And we're familiar with a lot of this. But the good news is that we're finally reindustrializing. And reshoring is just beginning. There's a bunch of literature out there, all these takeaways. The important thing is that we're finally putting trillions of dollars back into the economy to bring things home. And importantly, we're not just doing that with the status quo in mind. As we examine the global stage, it's clear that there are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. We're in one of those latter periods. But regardless of where the geopolitics is shaking out, importantly, demographics and geography are not destiny. They're powerful. But we believe in technology being a liberator and for founders to be able to wield influence and be able to actually enact change. And so regardless of all of these different outcomes, the world is shifting, which brings us back to today. We're witnessing one of the most unparalleled industrial build-outs in history. This is what it looked like 100 years ago. And this is what it looks like today. So there's a SpaceX opportunity in each of these verticals. The imminency is going to vary widely. Founders are building the global economy piece by piece. And this is what it looks like. On a macro scale, we see the size, the behemoths, the ability to enact change in huge categories. And then on a micro scale, we see that it touches everything in our lives. And so the thesis is that everything is going to get nuked. The world is going to get rebuilt, and we want to be there to support it. The most valuable companies in the future are not going to be ones where the problems are going to be solved by computers alone. They're going to be solved with people going after really hard problems using computers. So the first guy through the wall always gets bloody, always. Anybody who's not tearing their old model down and rebuilding it, they're dinosaurs. Don't be a dinosaur. And so as we shift to this part of the conversation, the most important thing that we get regaled with often is all these questions about these categories. Our founders get it. We get it from other co-investors, and certainly LPs also bring it up. And they're all valid. These are the core 6 questions that everyone has frequently discussed historically. The first one is follow-on capital. As we looked at the data, it turns out that the capital invested in the ADCU has grown 3x over the last 5 years. And to really hammer this, the last 15 years, there's only $50 billion that have poured in. And in the last 5 years, we had almost 3x that. Aerospace and defense is unsurprisingly leading the charge here, but also the same is true for hardware writ large. And the data really doesn't do it justice. These are some of the three most recent headlines that we found, but we're seeing this every day. Companies are building in hardware, they're raising huge rounds, they're able to get real traction, and capital is pouring in faster than most people realize. And so now the biggest bottleneck is gone. Historically, I highlighted there's only a few multi-stage firms, and now the entire universe is willing to bet in these categories. And so the ADCU is just getting started. And then the question is, well, is this venture scale? Really, the question then is, what is venture scale? To answer that, we're going to first look at, well, what is actually a tech company? To do that, we're going to go with the GOAT, Ben Thompson, who actually wrote about this in 2019. And the main points from this really is that software is a huge advantage against the rest of the world. It creates ecosystems that has infinite leverage, zero marginal costs, it gets better over time, and ultimately it's just a unique invention that you should wield to the best of your ability. And so as we were looking at that at Kantos, we were trying to figure out what are the 3 main factors that actually constitute a venture scale opportunity, because software wasn't the only way that venture scale businesses were created. And so what we settled with was high growth, high margins, and low dilution. Another way to think about it is that exponentiality, there's some form of power and leverage, and then there's efficiency. There's a bunch of factors that go into each of these, but ultimately it boils down to the fact that none of this is new. Turns out that people have been talking about this for a long time. On the growth side, we have a quote from Don Valentine about he was fixated on large markets, sometimes asking how many big companies are actually built in small markets. He had a similar perspective on margins. He thought that most young entrepreneurs were not going to be able to actually build huge businesses on 20 to 40% gross margins. They needed 60+% margins. And then ultimately, it comes down to capital efficiency. Doug Leone recently was talking about the fact that you should not raise as much as possible, raise as little as possible, get to your next milestones, and then go from there. So modestly, we're proposing a master formula for venture. It's the idea, it's the execution, and it's the capital efficiency. And you might multiply that all together by the minimum viable business and the time to revenue. So as we take that framing and apply it to those other questions, is there exponentiality here? Is there power and leverage? Is there efficiency? We can then look at these categories more holistically. So are these big enough markets? Software is really big. It's 5.4 trillion in the most aggressive estimates. Turns out that's less than 1% of global GDP. And the remaining categories are huge. Each of these are trillions of dollars. And within these categories, you have the old titans of industry that are equally massive. And as the world is changing more, the average age of a company on the S&P 500 is 16 years old. These companies are 111 years old. But do they have software margins? Which is really a question of how are they valued? So we're going to return back to that original slide on software is eating the world. And as we look at it, 9 of these 10 companies are tech companies, but it turns out most of them are actually hardware companies. And so it wasn't so much that software ate the world, it's that atoms ate the world. People who are really serious about software should build their own hardware. And as we examine this deeper, everyone wants tech multiples. That's ultimately what people are looking after. That's the eye on the prize. If you look through this list, one of the notable things that we find is that one, a lot of the hardware businesses have much higher margins than people realize because they're usually extremely differentiated, but a lot of their differentiation comes from software. So NVIDIA has CUDA, RTX, the Omniverse, Microsoft has Office, Azure, and their partnership with OpenAI. Apple is, everyone's familiar with iOS and macOS, but they also have the App Store and services. Amazon has AWS and services. And we can keep going down this list, but the important takeaway is that there's a software advantage that these companies have on top of the hardware that they're offering. The question then becomes, well, how big can these really be? The software surface area starts small and then expands over time. Amazon is a question of how big can e-commerce be? Tesla, how big can electric vehicles be? SpaceX, we're familiar, how big can launch be? It turns out really big. And then once you layer on other software, it turns out that you can add even more exciting opportunities to these businesses. AWS, full self-driving, robo-taxi, Starlink. When we think about this, the base case is that there's a big outcome. The bull case is that there's same size as the incumbents, which is quite big. And then there's the mega bull case, which is something like Tesla, where you're bigger, you're worth more than the next 24 automotive companies combined. As that software surface area increases, we find more and more exciting outcomes. And then that leads us to finally, is this capital efficient? Capital efficiency used to be the status quo. This is one of my favorite charts in this whole deck. It's taking some of the legendary venture companies, the year they were founded, how much capital they raised, and the time it took them to IPO. And what you'll see is that the average capital raised to IPO was only $8 million, which is smaller than a Series A round today. As importantly, though, the time to IPO was less than 5 years. Today, it's much, much different. Here's another sample set of software companies that have recently had exits. It's not that they're now raising 10x or 100x, it's over 100x the amount of capital needed and taking 2 to 5x as long to actually go public. And so today you have VC raised on average is 5.3 billion in over 12 years to go public. So this floated around earlier in the year in February as a champion idea, the narrative violation, the fact that these companies actually don't require as much capital as software companies. It's wrong. We looked at the data and it was completely incorrect. And so we ran it ourselves. And what we actually found was even more surprising. Software businesses on average, they raised $18 billion. Their valuation is a little over 100 billion. But the most important column here is that multiple, the enterprise value to the dollars raised, they're at 6.4x. If you look at a sample set of hardware companies, they've raised $6 billion, so a third of the capital. They're a little bit less than the total valuation on average, but their multiple is 13x, more than double. So it turns out that deep tech companies don't actually need that much more capital. The median cash raised by a deep tech company is only 6.6 million more than software companies. That's an 8% difference. And if you look at the data from the first half of 2025 alone, you see that the median cash raised from seed through Series C gets you into a similar spot for both software and deep tech. Hardware also has more durable graduation rates. So the percentage of companies that are making it from seed to Series A in 2 years or less is actually higher for hardware. And hardware, while it does have higher initial dilution, is able to offset it in later stages. And honestly, the dilution and this intensity is actually good because it forces you to make money. And this is counterintuitive to a lot of people, so we're going to spend some time on it. But SpaceX has experienced less than 50% dilution since founding. Elon still owns 40+% of the company. And the way they're able to do this is because their time to revenue was phenomenal. They're able to use government contracts, grants, and loans to be able to sustain the business The COTS contract famously gave them hundreds of millions of dollars, but soon after that, they were able to be awarded billions of dollars. NASA has given a lot of that, the Department of Defense, there's plenty of others. And we've seen this playbook with both Tesla and SpaceX. Elon's real superpower is getting government money, according to Jeff Bezos. The total contract value here is quite large. As my former boss liked to say, revenue solves all money problems. And so as we think about it, there's this great quote from one of my former colleagues where he's talking about the fact that it's actually amazing that there's real cost to building these AI businesses because it forces the companies to make money. And ironically, as they're doing it, they have to substantiate the value that they're providing. And it turns out that gives them a business model whose quality is actually way higher than the previous era of startup companies, software companies. Well, what about exits? We are very familiar with the fact that the median age of IPOs is currently 14 years long. It's crazy long. The top 1% of exit outcomes, though, has doubled every 5 years. And to really hammer this, we've seen the top 1% of exits essentially double every 5 years. If this trend continues, then we're not looking at a $5 billion exit outcome or a $10 billion exit outcome. We're looking at $40 billion. And even with inflation, a $1 billion exit in 2025 still matters, depending on your fund size. As we're dissecting all of this, one of the other things we're looking at is actually the chance of exit within these categories. So we actually broke it down on each of the software categories, the ADCU, you see AR, VR, robotics, advanced manufacturing, 3D printing. Turns out that ADCU companies have 2.4% odds of having a 250 million exit or more. Software companies have 1.27%. And this leads us to my favorite part, which is a short history lesson. Every time there's a new category that's created in venture, it's always questioned. Let's look at Shopify. So in this original memo from Bessemer, they thought one of the biggest possible outcomes was $50 million. Shopify IPO'd at $1.3 billion, and today it's worth 200. And the same is true for fintech. This is a great quote from Frank Rotman of QED. They started their firm in 2008. It was perfectly the worst time to start investing in fintech. No one wanted to fund anything in it. There wasn't even a word for that. And then they had a great line. They were open for business. Turns out there was no business. But if you look at the amount of dollars deployed globally, the first year they started the firm, it was about $1 billion of dollars. And then in the peak 2021 era, $140 billion was flowing into fintech at the time. And even today, it's still well over 100. Fintech was questioned, and now it's a dominant venture category. This is the total number of exits in each of the different buckets. As importantly, though, the outcomes ended up being much bigger than anyone expected. This is a select global fintech exits, over $5 billion. This doesn't even include Stripe, and this is just a good, I think, visual to show that outcomes can be much larger in the tech universe than people originally let on. Remember, how big can these really be? Turns out, very big. If you make it through, you're alone. The competitive intensity is pretty low. And that leads us to the final thought on this, which is waiting for the what's that moment. M&A is often one of the big catalysts for these new categories because it acts as a new showing point, a new price discovery for the rest of the market to see what's possible. Famously, we saw that with Instagram in the early 2010s. Facebook acquired it for $1 billion, which is 2 years later was actually the real one, which is when Facebook paid $19 million for WhatsApp. And so we anticipate that there's going to be some sort of a similar moment in these categories, whether it's an IPO or an acquisition. And as we look at these new categories, we get excited because that begs the question of moments like this are incredibly rare. It's really only the 2007, 2008 era in these categories. So how do you take advantage of it? This brings us to our opportunity for the great industrial build out. So what does that smell? Money. Every era of venture has crowned new winners and firms. And it's because the new types of companies require new approaches and insights to how you're building and what you're building. And this isn't a fully exhaustive or representative list, but it's directionally supposed to show the fact that each era of venture has anointed new firms and they've been able to take advantage of these new opportunities. We at Kantos are really focused at the beginning. Beginnings are special. They're qualitatively different than everything that comes after. There's a great quote from 0 to 1, and it's been true 13.8 billion years ago, and it's certainly true today. And when we think about Kanto and Kantos, we like to equate it to a canto in an epic or a long poem. It's a chapter, it's a verse, it's a section of a great story. We view startups as the modern day epics. Founders are the heroes on the journey. We want to be the guides for that. We want to be involved in the very first canto of your epic, the first chapter, and what we hope will be a glorious and marvelous story. And we want to back founders that are pursuing greatness. Not all quests are alike, and we're specifically drawn to the founders that are going after the biggest problems because we want to back them as they help change the world. So we want to be the force multiplier. We want to be the guides, and our benchmark is to be the first check, the first partner, and the first phone call. I love the way you guys do deep tech. We get these messages a bunch. Well, how do we do it? It's all about the founders. And as we look at this, there's founders are riding, we really like the wave metaphor. Founders are riding these huge waves. There's deep currents that they're channeling. The guides have hopefully pulled them into a position where they can channel and ride that. And then everyone else is watching. And the reason we do this is because ideas change. Startups aren't companies. Their final form doesn't exist yet. This is a famous email from Paul Graham to Fred Wilson talking about the idea for this company called Airbed and Breakfast and how the people were really amazing and the idea could change. And we know how that panned out. And that's why we underwrite to people and then ideas. And ideas are a reflection of the founders. So we need to see how they navigate the idea maze, how they traverse the terrain, which means that we need better ways of actually understanding how they're doing that, what's happening, how the ecosystem is evolving. And this is something that we're quite passionate about. It's the deep tech playbook. As over time, we've been able to aggregate a lot of the lessons from some of the trailblazer companies in our portfolio, other founders we work closely with. And as we've looked at history and to these examples, we've been able to start aggregating different insights that these founders have been putting together. It's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And this playbook is fundamentally different in many ways than what your standard
trailblazer companies,
lean startup model is like. So core pillar here is oftentimes you have to do things yourself. Enter full stack startups. So Ian wrote this shortly after I joined Andreessen. This became a canonical piece in the ecosystem. If your technology is better, but potential customers are too set in their ways to switch, you have to use it yourself and compete with that. One of the other principles we have here is the fact that hardware usually has to be your Trojan horse, so you can have an ability to deliver software. And the best teams are centaurs. They're able to understand that. They take their expertise from Silicon Valley and they combine that with a heritage workforce from their respective industries. And then once you're able to do that, oftentimes there's the V8 index where you can accordion costs down, you start doing things in-house, you're able to build something better than what the status quo is. One of the other things we look for is desperation as a proxy for product market fit. It's the same definition as the Supreme Court case. You know it when you see it. And the other thing that's really important here is that there has to be a level of intentionality when you're building these categories. You only have so many bullets in the chamber. You can't spray and pray your way to greatness. You can't pivot your way to greatness. You have to be very thoughtful and methodical. And this brings us back to that deep tech score we were talking about earlier. The reason why this all combines together, though, is that as you think about the intentionality, we get really excited with founders that have a true encyclopedic knowledge for a given category. My old firm likes to talk about the navigating the idea maze. We take it a step further and think about, we want to find maze historians, people that know every inch of history of any given topic and category. They know how every maze was built, who built it, why they built it, what materials were used, and the fastening of it. And if you do that, then we feel like you have a much better chance of success because you're going to be able to more accurately navigate the terrain and then also build something quickly, which leads us to iterate or die. We need to be able to have a high cycle time. You need to be able to iterate. And as you do that, you also have to make sure that you're not building the field of dreams fallacy, because if you build it, they probably won't come. is you have to be methodical about what you're doing, why you're doing it. Again, the intentionality is really important. And the recipe is simple. It's executing it that's really hard. You start with a blank slate. You design solutions from scratch. Use mature existing technologies, and then you layer in the new tech stacks. Deeper research is still required, though. And one of the things that we think about is, I want you to just stop saying on shit. Let's just move on to the next part. This is the most important thing in this entire presentation. Deeper research. There's a huge tension here between the fact that there's a Buffett quote that I love. A lot of people that know me have heard me say this ad nauseum now. When a management team with a reputation of excellence goes up against an industry with bad economics, the business is going to maintain its reputation. Let's just move on to the next. And the fundamental reality is there's a reason that most of these companies and categories have not been disrupted. There's a reason they're 111 years old. Importantly, the experts are wrong. This is one of my favorite articles ever from the Times, October 9th, 1903. They're talking about how long it's going to take for humans to actually be able to finally pilot an aircraft. And they determined it'd be 1 million to 10 million years. Reputation of excellence. 2 months later, the Wright brothers made their first flight. And this leads to one of my favorite quotes from Henry Ford, which is, if I ever wanted to kill the opposition by unfair means, I would endow the opposition with experts. They would have so much good advice that I could be sure they would do so little work. So as we close out here, I have a few thoughts. We're in a very unique period of time. We're quite excited about the future. And we actually think in many ways it's similar to the first industrial build-out. There's a great quote from Brian Arthur. In the 1850s, the US's economy was small. Right before the Civil War, it wasn't much bigger than Italy's. And 40 years later, it ended up becoming the largest economy in the whole world. And what changed in between was the railroads. They linked the east of the country to the west and the interior to both. And the economy was never the same. We're at a similar moment now. We feel like the age of innovation is just getting started. We don't know anything yet. And as we look to the future, we're quite excited to be able to partner with some amazing entrepreneurs. They're tackling some of the hardest problems in the industry and in the world. And we feel quite strongly that as we look back in these next few years, we're going to say that this was one of the definitive moments when everything started to inflect. So with that, thank you.